one of the things I did learn while I was out there was I'm not the only person who feels that the reason that this whole COVID pandemic was been such a disaster is that it's really run and manipulated by the big pharmaceutical companies who control not only the governments, but they did it through the super governmental organizations such as the United Nations and the World Health Organization, both of which I think are long since past their sell-by date, and neither are fit for purpose. And it was a tragedy that the governments said they would do what they were told. And now the WHO, of course, wants the governments to sign up so they will be in charge next time they release the virus. And they will be able to tell you, you must buy all these vaccines of us, even though we haven't tested them and we don't know whether they work, and you're going to pretend they're not dangerous. I mean, this is what it taught me about this. I mean, why would anybody fall for this? I mean, the only people who came anywhere near to this was Angus Dalgleish and the Swedish fellow who said he wasn't going to have this lockdown nonsense, because that again was dictated from the WHO, China, what have you. And anybody with half a brain who has thought it through, and those in the Great Barrington Declaration and Angus basically saw it for what it was, that it would cause far more trouble than it's worth. And even the Hallett inquiry did say, why did nobody do a cost-benefit analysis on the lockdown? And I mean, it was obvious. Why would you do something that ended up costing us £1 trillion? I estimate that's the cost, £1 trillion of our economy. Actually, probably more, because the damage done to generations of people at school, university, and their jobs, and mental health and non-productivity is probably going to make that small beer 10, 20 years down the line.
Incalculable.
People challenged this and said, it is an airborne disease. You should treat it like that. And I said that right from the very beginning. But to find people who'd been punished for this was just unbelievable. Talking to really good, experienced doctors, I felt really sorry. And then there's the second wave of people who'd been sacked for either refusing to have the vaccine because they felt quite rightly they didn't need it. I mean, if you've had COVID, I argued this right from the beginning. Why do you need a vaccine if you've already had the disease? You never give a vaccine if you had a disease for anything other than, say, if you get rabies, and that's because you vaccinate before the thing takes off, and that's about the only time that I'm aware of. And then there were people who were struck off, GPs, for deciding, quite rightly, not to give the booster to patients who'd had such terrible reactions to the first two. Well, I mean, if you have a terrible reaction to a drug, you don't take it again just because it says this is what you have. No, you stop it completely and look for an alternative pathway.
Yeah. This is incredible. I mean, if someone's allergic to penicillin, you'll get your red pen out on the top of the medicines card and write allergic to penicillin. And then you wouldn't expect someone to write up penicillin as the first drug to be prescribed. It's just incredible.
Yeah, all common sense went out the window with this. Not of the doctors. I would defend them to the end. It is all common sense, and how to manage this pandemic went out of the window from the very, very top of the government all the way down. And I am furious at all the agencies that supported this nonsense. The Royal Colleges, I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. The BMA and all the doctors' unions, etc. And people who run the NHS, the chief medical officer, all the way down to the chief medical officer of the trusts, they all fell for this. They must have known it was wrong. And that's what I couldn't understand. So the tour of New Zealand in particular opened my eyes to just how draconian these great doctors were. And of course, both in Australia and New Zealand, they're desperately short of doctors and nurses because they fired so many of them for being good. It is really dreadful.
Good clinicians need not apply. We'll just have a few crummy ones. It's just well, yeah. But the comments I get that are just so outraged, really, is that you have this simple preparation that you and your co-workers have generated. I want to have it, but you're not allowed to give it to me. It's just outrageous. I want your intradermal mycobacterium to upgrade all of my immune system because I'm too old. I want my immune system upgraded to reduce my chances of cancer, to reduce my chances of all infections, and my government does not allow me to have it. This is just... It's hard to get over that, but and many people watching the videos feel the same. So
yeah, and it's the same government and authorities that won't allow you to have this, which the company would be very, very grateful to be able to make available. But it's the same government that basically wouldn't allow you to have, sensible precautions for when you got upper respiratory symptoms. It might be COVID. The same governments, and when I say governments, this is around the world. I mean, this is what makes it so sinister. It was exactly the same that I found in my colleagues from the United States and Canada, then Australia and New Zealand. It's all the same. We now know ivermectin would have cured COVID in very ill people. It's been a number of studies which are positive, yet Fauci went on and lied and said it was toxic and dangerous horse only. And I think that probably led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, because everybody I've talked to who used it, nobody has had a death from it. And I myself used it on 2 patients who were really ill after they'd had everything else but didn't want to go to hospital, and they responded to it. So I know from personal experience it works. So the same government wouldn't let you have that won't let you have this. So why won't they let you have things that we know are very simple, safe and effective? I mean, ivermectin is unbelievably low toxicity.
It's one of the world's safest drugs, isn't it, really? Safer than ibuprofen or paracetamol or acetaminophen.
Far safer. I mean, it's given to millions of people around the world and saves the lives. It's not only lives, but the eyesight. It's said to save 2 million people a year from going blind from the filaria. Yeah.
And yet has antiviral properties. And should we mention now potential anti-cancer properties? Seeing we're talking about.
Well, I think the fact that there's been publications on it. I mean, I recently reviewed an enormous one looking at how it could be an anti-cancer agent. When the sequence was published in early 2020, it was published in Nature. We know by force, by a very honourable Chinaman basically leaked it. Otherwise, the Chinese authorities still wouldn't probably have let us know what it was.
Is that right?
It's very well documented in Matt Ridley's book Viral, actually, if anyone wants to go into it. Everybody assumed it was very similar to SARS and therefore was definitely a zoonosis. And they failed to note the changes such as a smoking gun, etc., etc. When I said they failed, the Chinese Wuhan group that did the sequencing showed that this site was there, and in their discussion, they didn't mention it. It was the equivalent of Nelson putting the telescope to his blind eye. They knew it was there, but they didn't want to draw attention to it. So at any rate, so this is what I basically wanted to know. If you could go on to the next slide, was that Berger and his colleagues there were really spot on, whereas I was continually back down, said, of course it's a zoonosis, because SARS was a zoonosis, SARS-1.
Yes, so SARS-1 there was an animal reservoir there. It was identical.
And this was similar, so it was assumed, but basically my cry was, let's look at the science, because this is remarkably similar to sequences that have come out of this Wuhan lab and have been published in normal journals in the West. So it's no conspiracy. It has this come from the lab. Well,
so let me just see what we've got here, Gus. So this nicely coloured bit, that's the actual molecules that comprise the virus.
This is the modelling from the molecule put on all electric very sophisticated modelling data from known proteins, etc.
So that's basically the virus there. That you're looking at, all
what
these
little red things show, they're the inserts which have been inserted into the virus in the laboratory. Now, nobody's got time to go into all the details of this, that and the other. So you have to basically go up a gear. When you put in a lot of inserts, what does it mean? It means that you interfere with the logical amino acids that these sequences produce. And this is why Berger's observation was so seminal that I could understand it immediately without going on extra courses. And it's that simple. You can see there the yellow was the SARS-CoV-2 had basically a charge of over 8, whereas the ordinary SARS virus, and it goes for the rest of them, have a charge of less than 6.
So this is a positive electrical charge, just like the positive pole of the battery. And that's there because there's lots of positive amino acids have been inserted in all together.
This was done deliberately in order to make it more effective.
Because normally they would repel each other anyway, wouldn't they? So you wouldn't expect a lot of positive amino acids together.
Cell membranes are negative. So normally a virus would go hunting around the cell looking for a receptor.
Right. So you've got all these positive bits all clumped together. So that's going to electrically attach itself to the negative cell membrane. You've got virtual guaranteed penetration of the cell there.
It's the equivalent of a fridge magnet.
Yep.
It goes whang, locks on, and you won't get it off.
Clamps onto the cell, and that's it. The virus is well and truly glued to the cell.
It should only start attaching if it's got the right receptor and binds to it properly and the proper co-receptors. So that to me was seminal, absolute proof. And I went away and looked at these inserts, and there were publications saying they had put some of these inserts into cells to make them more infectious for human cells. So how on earth was this a conspiracy theory that was shut down? I mean, and I can say Matt Ridley says that he even took this up with prominent people in the Royal Society who told him, no, they hadn't looked at the sequences because there was no point. It was obvious it was a SARS. What's the point of a Royal Society that can't bother to look at the evidence? I mean, it's out there, absolute disgrace. And if I could then move on, the next slide. Basically,
so lots of positive bits there. So am I right in saying that because it's so positive, it doesn't actually need a specific receptor on the surface of the cell to adsorb into? It would just stick onto the membrane. Yeah,
well, it's so well finely tuned for the ACE2 receptor, it was always going to hit that. Right. But if we could jump on three slides actually.
Yep.
This one, this is the one, this is ideal. We showed that that the charge was so strong it was able to use receptors other than the ACE2.
Yes, I've heard this.
This was important. We could bind to the co-receptor binding domain was used by a immunological receptor, but the ganglioside ones and glycoproteins, etc., it was able to attach to receptors that are involved in suppression of innate immunity, taste and smell. Does that ring a bell?
It does rather. So there's
this explains why so many people lost the taste and smell. You can with other viruses, but it's usually transient. But this was so vicious that I spoke to many people, lost the taste and smell for weeks and weeks at a time.
Months.
I think this explains it. So here we had this very good evidence. And what I want to go on to that is that everybody said no. It came naturally. They searched wet markets, they chased dogs around and tested them, and they still couldn't find this elusive animal between the bat and the human. It did not exist. That's why, because it came straight from the lab, beautifully protected. So I want to go to the next slide now.
I'm not quite sure. I can't quite see why the loss of taste and smell comes from that molecular architecture, Gus. What is it? What is it about the molecular manipulation that?
Well, it's able to attach to those known receptors.
Okay. So it attaches to the taste and smell receptors in the nose and the mouth.
And this was detailed work that I personally.
I see. So it increases the amount of tissues it can bind to.
I wouldn't have picked up that detail. It was Berger did the detail, but as soon as I was aware the receptors were involved in taste and smell. As a clinician, I said, that makes sense. And we know that you can. I did a lot of work with HIV and the CD4 receptor, so I know that there's other things other than the main receptor that determine your pathogenicity. So I was very receptive to this. But what I want to really go to, and I think that this is the highlight. I'm just going to go to the next one. I jump over Omicron because that just showed that
the furin cleavage site.
That's the furin cleavage site, which was there, but they ignored. If you go to the next one, this is basically about Omicron and how it evolved so differently from the others. And this is the reason I like this is because this was the perfect vaccine. Omicron was the most perfect coronavirus vaccine because it was highly infectious and it wasn't
the best virus, you mean, not vaccine.
Best viral vaccine you could have. So we go to the next one. I want to highlight.
And I'm not quite sure. Are we talking about the virus or the vaccine here, Gus?
That's the virus showing how different that modelling had become. And in fact, it had open variants and closed variants, and the fact it was able to open and close, it could still bind to receptors, but it could close and avoid the immune response to it.
Right. So the Omicron is much more immune resistant than the previous. So we've got the Omicron on the right and the previous strain on the left, have we?
They're both the Omicron, but the trimer is open on the left and it's closed on the right, and so it shows that way it was able to avoid immune responses directly to the spike. But I'd like to go to the next slide because this is what became really important. It showed, and the South Africans reported this. There was no difference between the vaccinated and unvaccinated, whether you got infected, ill or dead. Absolutely zero.
With the Omicron,
it meant all the first vaccines were a total waste of time. This was actually good because it did actually cause an immunisation. I was furious at the way London handled this. They treated the South Africans as if their peasants didn't know what they were talking about, when in fact they were actually telling us the clue, the secret, and these guys carried on with the lockdowns. I mean, this should have been an absolute stop the lockdown. So they didn't even do that. So the next slide is the really big important one. If we go to that, this is it. This is what we did right at the beginning. Is as soon as we realised that this virus had been engineered to be hyper infectious, and it has escaped from the lab. And basically, we were silenced. No journal would publish it. Every journal turned down our work with the same words. They said, "This is not in the public interest." So how did the editorial board of Nature, Science, Cell, Virology, Lancet, how do they all come to use the same words? This was set up. This was organised. This is what you do. I mean, it's unbelievable. But this slide was the most important of all of this. Because I said, if you can't understand charge and you can't understand escape from a lab, you have to understand this. Because a blast analysis shows that 80% of that spike protein is homologous with human proteins. Therefore, if you use the spike protein as the vaccine, you are 100% guaranteed to get side effects from it. And therefore, you should avoid it. That simple. You cut this 80% out. But not one major company did this.
This is a really important point here, Gus. So what we're saying is 80% of the spike protein is common with human proteins. Therefore, if you give a vaccine that targets the spike protein, it's inevitable that that's going to target human tissues.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, there's now 131 conditions have been described as side effects of the vaccine.
Well, why on earth did they pick the spike protein? Why not some envelope protein or something else?
They picked the spike, but what is again sinister that everybody picked the same spike, whether it be AZ, Pfizer, Moderna, the whole lot of them.
Do we know why?
In spite of the warning. And we made this warning very, very high. Now, we found two well-known homologous proteins were 100% homologous. Platelet factor 4.
So it means they're exactly the same as the spike.
Yeah. And myelin. Well, platelet factor 4, that came out as causing dreadful clotting and platelet dysfunction, VITT syndrome. That is very quickly recognised. It killed the AstraZeneca program. And what I will say about AstraZeneca, we know this happened because they let their side effect book open. It was common knowledge and not manipulated like Pfizer and Moderna. So Pfizer and Moderna said theirs is a dangerous vaccine, you must stop using it. But we'll carry on.
Full credit to AstraZeneca really for admitting their mistake.
Absolutely. This is the point I actually want to make. Whereas Pfizer and Moderna basically kept their side effect books closed for confidentiality reasons, and indeed applied to have them locked down for 75 years. Well, there's nothing like following the science. If you lock down all your data for 75 years, it means you're not following the science. Now, the other one, which is very important, the myelin.
Yeah, the myelin. This is the sheaths round about the nerves.
Yeah, I mean, this also arises with flu vaccines too. The myelin.
Does it?
But yeah, and Guillain-Barré, which is the disease you get when you get antibodies to myelin, there is a background with flu. But because it was 100% on this one, we knew this was going to be horrendous. And I know loads of people who've had Guillain-Barré, including people in my own family who had booster vaccines when I told them not to. Their GPs bullied them into it. This is another thing that I'm furious about. And one of the GPs basically said that when they pointed out that I said not to have them, this again was pointed out that I'm a medical oncologist. I know nothing about vaccines and immunology. Roll your arm up, and bullied them into having it. And then they got Guillain-Barré and 6 months paralysis. Before it started. So it's the cost to the NHS. I've
worked with these patients in intensive care. They can be paralysed for weeks and months.
Exactly.
And it's a terrifying condition because sometimes they can't breathe properly for weeks.
Yeah. And I know 2 people in my small social circle and family who were paralysed in hospital with Guillain-Barré immediately after the vaccine. So that means that it is unbelievable, and it's on the MHRA website where they use very rare. If you know 2 people, it's not rare.
Yeah, but completely predictable based on the biochemistry of the spike protein being the same as the receptors on the myelin.
Here's the real crime. I use the word advisedly. They ignored it. Sage, the chief medical officer, the chief scientific officer. Everybody ignored this extreme warning. And yet, the whole pandemic response was predicated on the absurd, useless speculation of Neil Ferguson and his, what I call teenage scribblers on their PlayStations.
Silly primitive computer modelling, wasn't it?
And make primitive computer models, making out absurd thing. And they said, we have to act in case this is true. This was 100% science. And they chose to ignore it.
Yeah. So he had an unjustified assumption followed by unjustified assumption into an arbitrary equation that generated an arbitrary outcome.
Yeah.
And the government acted on that and ignored proper science. It really is quite, Yeah. It's understandable for politicians, but their medical advisors should have been a bit more switched on, I would have thought.
And the MHRA and regulatory authorities, I have to put that down. They are totally, utterly incompetent. It's the only word. They're either incompetent or they were bribed to look the other way, or both. Neither explanation is acceptable.
Yep. Quite bizarre. Where are we going now?
Now, I'd like to finish on this for this section.
Yep, please do.
If we could.
Yep.
Because when I stand up and do these things, I might get that we're getting less and less problems. But somebody would stand up and say, well, it's very easy to be right in retrospect. This is why this slide, I think for this session, will be the last one, because I think it shows it is not retrospect. This was all prospect. We had to disguise came from the lab and affects how you design a vaccine. We got it into the quarterly review of biophysics discovery, a journal I'd never heard of before. And we had to change the title because as soon as it suggested it came from the lab, every journal turned it down. Fortunately, the editor of this journal, being a biophysicist, understood the charge argument immediately. And he said, that's really important. We want to put it in. So that's how we got it in.
But the key thing is you've got the publication there from the middle of 2020.
So it was all there, and it was all submitted to Cabinet and everybody. It went through directly to Michael Gove, who gave it to people. Won't try and hide that. But this last paper is probably even more damning and important. Here it says this title is Mitigating Coronavirus-Induced Dysfunctional Immunity, for that's what it does. It destroys your immune response to anything. Trained immunity, BCG, and new old friends. And here we actually do probably the best review of how IMM 101, Mycobacteria obiense, works in the entire literature. It's probably the best review. But not before we go through the following. It's probably the only review that reviewed all coronavirus vaccine attempts to date and pointed out why they all failed. The reason they all fail is they have this amazing ability to induce antigenic sin or immunological imprinting. What this means is that once the immune system has seen the vaccine, it won't see anything remotely similar to it. It just pump out antibodies to this vaccine, which has been made against a virus which mutates so fast it wasn't even around when the vaccines were introduced 9 months later, let alone
you're producing antibodies to the vaccine, but not producing antibodies to the current virus.
Exactly. And this means that the antibodies are completely useless and they end up enhancing infection because they bind to other coronaviruses that look like coronaviruses, but they bind to a bit and don't neutralize it, bring it into the cell and enhance infection. And this
so
is
when it's in the cell, the virus can then multiply in the cell.
Multiplies. And we said that this will actually mean that the vaccines will be worse than useless. They will enhance infection. And by the way, we just like to point out, why did anybody who was developing these vaccines not note that all the attempts when they get into primates are fatal? So why do coronavirus vaccines, why are they fatal in primates? Everyone seems to have ignored that and not bothered with that. But
I didn't know that. So if you give the current generation of vaccines to monkeys, it kills them.
No, this was the previous ones before. I think you'll find they didn't bother with primates because they knew about this, so they weren't going to do it. So the bottom line of all this is that not only did this predict that the vaccines would be useless, but also they'd make things even worse. Now, the Cleveland Clinic has continued to update to the point now where they show that for each vaccine, your chances of getting COVID go up. It's now over 3.5 times that if you didn't have the booster. So they've actually charted it, and give them their due. They have published this. They have published it. They started, it was vaccines program for their staff. And it clearly shows that the staff who didn't get vaccinated did far better, and the people who have the boosters go down with COVID. Well, that's exactly what I observed in hospital. All the people in my staff who had the boosters, they were the ones, were off for a week with dreadful COVID the week next. And so I'd like to stop there.
That's fine, Gus. Thank you.
And then go into the other issues.
Well, a warm welcome to this talk. Now, it's the end of May 2025 and we're still seeing excess deaths in most Western countries, but not in Eastern countries. What could the difference possibly be? And I'm still getting huge amounts of comments and emails on people claiming that they're still suffering from adverse events of mRNA vaccines as well. But let me give you some evidence for the excess deaths first of all. Now, this is from the Our World in Data site. Now, here we see the United States. Now, this line here is 5%. So we see that 2021, after the vaccine rollout, the excess death was very high there, actually, wasn't it? But it's persisting. That's the 10% line there. And there's the 15% line. So we see excess deaths in the United States have been above the 10% mark for quite a long period of time. This is an ongoing issue compared to 2015 to 2019 levels. So in the United States, it's clearly there. What about other countries? Let's have a look at, this is the United Kingdom. Now here's the zero line here. And again, we can see that for a lot of the time, we're quite above the zero line. And for not much of the time, we're below the zero line. So excess deaths here, typically around about the 10% mark in the United Kingdom. Now, it's important to remember, of course, as I've said many times, after the pandemic, when a lot of vulnerable people died from various issues, one of them, for example, was midazolam and morphine, but various people died, particularly older people died. So the people that might have gone on to die in the next few years, that died, kind of all died all of a sudden in 2020. So we should see a reduction in excess deaths, as we see in Eastern European and other countries, Russia, for example, where they didn't have any mRNA vaccine rollout, coincidentally. Anyway, let's look at a few more examples. That is the United Kingdom. So again, not a good position there in excess deaths, very little talked about. And the Office for National Health Improvements and Disparity used to publish a breakdown data on this. They've stopped. Data is no longer available. Hard to get data now on causes of death and age of death in the United Kingdom. A pity they stopped doing that. No idea why they stopped doing that. Let me know what you think. This is Canada. Well, I mean, heck. Well, good to see that reduction in Canada there. Let's hope that's real at the end of 2024. But basically, 2021, 2022, 2023, Canada excess deaths here between sort of, what, 10 and 20%. This is just like a huge amount of excess deaths, in addition to those lost during the, as a result of the pandemic and the mismanagement and the malmanagement during the pandemic. This is Australia, and again, 10% lines there. Excess deaths are persisting in Australia, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, where we have the latest data. Similar, very similar pattern. This is New Zealand. The data's a bit more jaggedy there. The reason for that, of course, it's a smaller population, so fluctuations in death aren't smoothed out as much. But the trend is definitely there, again. Netherlands, again, typically 10%, virtually never dropping below the 0 mark, where it should be below that all the time. Typically around about the 10 to 20% mark in the Netherlands. Again, way higher than would be expected. Ireland, again, 10 to 20%. I mean, I think you're starting to see some consistency in these patterns now. We'll be talking about what this means in a little more detail in a minute. This is Denmark, again, typically around about the 10% mark. Very rarely that it's below the average excess deaths. Germany, again, pretty similar pattern. Israel, again, fairly similar pattern. This spike here in deaths, of course, was due to the terrorist atrocities that occurred. It's not a disease-related situation. But excess deaths ongoing in Israel, bumbling along at round about the, again, typically that's 10%, that's 20% mark. South Korea, very highly vaccinated country. Excess deaths there very often above 20%. Japan, very highly vaccinated country. Excess deaths here always above what would be expected. At the moment, we're about 27% above what would be expected. These are horrific figures which are simply not being talked about. Bizarre. Germany, looked at. France, very similar pattern. That's the 10% line there in France. Singapore, again, highly vaccinated country, very high levels of excess deaths persisting. Taiwan, again, very high levels. Now, Russia, we're looking at a few examples now where it's lower. Russia, of course, below what will be expected. And this is exactly what we would expect as a result of the pandemic, where vulnerable people for various reasons are no longer with us. So Russia actually doing pretty well there, below average deaths, below average after the end of 2021 at least. So that's from early 2022, below average. Different to the pattern here. Romania, again, very similar pattern, lower than expected. Armenia, lower than expected. Georgia, again, this is Georgia, the country in Eastern Europe, not Georgia, the state. Again, typical pattern, very low. Kyrgyzstan, again, lower than would be expected. Whereas the United States, United Kingdom, and all those other countries are higher than would be expected. So for this not to be represented as a real problem is just perplexing. Now, we did look at this paper here about a year ago, I think it was, excess mortality across countries in the Western world since COVID-19 pandemic. Our world in data estimates of January 2020 to January 2022. Now, I'm not going to do this paper in detail. We did it last year, but that's the paper. So 47 countries, there was over 3 million excess deaths. In 2021, excess deaths were in 42 countries. 2022, excess deaths in 43 countries. A lot of excess deaths in that 2-year period, well over 3 million. Conclusion from this paper, excess mortality has remained high in the Western world for 3 consecutive years. And now, sadly, we've seen for 5 consecutive years.
Joining us now to discuss this is Independent Medical Alliance Senior Fellow of Pediatric Cardiology, Dr. Kirk Milhoan. Good morning to you, Doctor. Welcome to the National News Desk. Great to have you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
This new study about the safety of COVID mRNA vaccines was published in the International Journal of Cardiovascular Research and Innovation, as I understand it. Tell us about the scope of this research and really your top findings from it.
So it's a compilation of studies that really have been out there since 2021. We saw a signal in the vaccine product causing problems, especially in the young adults, especially young males, that was causing heart inflammation. And so what we have done is compiled all those different peer-reviewed journals, articles, and data, and put them in one place, easily accessible, with 42 pages and 341 references of our concerns that this is a real issue and these vaccines do little good for healthy children and young adults.
Right. Were you able to distinguish the cause of myocarditis, the differential between a COVID infection versus it being just an adverse reaction to the COVID vaccine?
Yes, it's very clear from a number of reasons that we've been able to evaluate. And primarily, there was a great study out of the Nordic countries that studied 23 million children and young adults, and they found that the people who had the least amount of myocarditis were the unvaccinated. And as you increase the number of vaccine doses, or you use Moderna versus Pfizer, your risk just kept stepping up in terms of your risk for myocarditis. Once again, in a disease state that is really very mild for healthy children and young adults.
You know, initially, this topic was so rare when we first heard about this, myocarditis and the links, to the vaccine. But what does the data reveal now?
So there was a study out of Lancet that showed and looked at all these children who had been harmed by the vaccine and had myocarditis secondary to the vaccine. And they looked at them 90 days out. And a lot of things remained normal, except their cardiac MRI, which showed and continued inflammation and possible scarring of the heart itself 90 days out. Further studies, a new study released by Yale said that they're still seeing free-floating spike protein, which is what that vaccine asks the body to make, which is a cardiotoxin still floating around in the body for over 700 days.
Wow.
It was supposed to just be put in and your body made an immune response and then it went away, but it is hanging around in some people.
So it's not transitory. It's not resolving over time. I mean, there's like long-term impacts we're seeing right now.
Yeah, for certain people, it is devastating and long-term issues for a disease process that they have very little risk for.
Wow. So for more information, you can visit imahealth.org. And Doctor, we appreciate you joining us this morning to talk about this very important topic.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, I don't think there's really any need to say more than that. Dr. Milhoan has expressed that really quite well. The link for the paper is there. Download it for yourself. Very readable, nice piece of work. This is now in the public domain. Anyone can get it. And if regulators carry on ignoring this, I will be confused. Now, here we have the all adverse events reported filed under the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System in the United States. From 1990 through to 2024. So the quiz is, guess what year was 2021, the year of the vaccine rollout? Well, I don't think you'll be too surprised that it's the first big red column. 2021 vaccine rollout year. Now, it's true that there were more vaccines given during that time, but the amount of adverse events reported is massively disproportionate, as we'll see in a minute. So that's the first part of the quiz. This is the second part. Now, these are deaths reported under the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System domestic data. All death adverse events reported. And I'm not going to make light of this. 2021, again, is the obvious year there. The year of the vaccine rollout. And we see that the deaths were over 10,500 in that time period, which is completely unacceptable. Now, I'm just going to give you the conclusion of this paper before we look at it. Or maybe just look at the paper first. Here's the paper itself. This is the paper here. Now, it's an incredibly thorough piece of work. This is a very impressive piece of academia. They've tied everything together. I was really quite taken aback when I read this paper, the quality of it. So here is the study here, myocarditis after SARS coronavirus 2 infection and COVID-19 vaccination, epidemiology outcomes and new perspectives. Now, it's just incredibly thorough piece of work. I'm not going to sort of scroll through it all, but if we just look down, it covers amazing amount of detail, ties together all the literature pretty well. So it runs to, what is it? Page 1 to 43. And the amount of referencing and scholarship in here is really quite impressive. The amount of work that's been done on this to get this compilation. We're down to what? Good grief, 100 and... Yeah. How many references are there? 341 references. Really is quite an impressive piece of work. And the conclusion. We urge governments to remove the COVID-19 mRNA products from the market. Pretty clear. Due to the well-documented risk of myocardial damage, a risk that is strongest for young males in the, under 40 years of age. Now, in a minute, we're going to be hearing from Independent Medical Alliance, Senior Fellow of Paediatrics and Cardiology, Dr. Kirk Milhoan. So let's just listen to the introduction from Fox News. This is the introduction under this reference here. This only lasts for a few seconds, and it just gives us some useful context that's very nicely expressed.
A groundbreaking new study sounding alarms about the safety of COVID mRNA vaccines, directly challenging claims from public health officials and raising urgent questions about transparency and trust. So using hard data from disease trends, from patient outcomes and immune system analysis, multiple research reports show that heart inflammation risks tied to the vaccines may be far greater and maybe even more dangerous than previously reported, particularly among young men.
Well, more from that report in a minute, and we'll listen to the segment from Dr. Kirk Milhoan as well. But just so you know, we're not making this up, as always. This is the journal here. This is the full reference. PDF is available. Myocarditis typically manifesting as myopericarditis, so the heart muscle and the layers around the heart are typically inflamed. Itis simply means inflammation of. Is among the serious cardiac consequences observed over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. And here we have a comprehensive evidence-based literature synthesis. So they've actually synthesized this together. It's a very, very nice piece of work, as I said. Clinical trial data reanalysis, post-marketing surveillance, large observational studies, epidemiological, clinical and immunological perspectives. Now, I'm just going to show you some of the data. We'll probably do this paper in a little more detail in subsequent videos, but let's just look at some of the important data that's come out from it now. This first one we see here, this is the adverse events types reported. So this is not adverse events, it's the different types, the different manifestations of adverse events. And we see it 6 times, the types of adverse events are 6.2 times higher. So 6 times more than we would expect. Now, to be fair, there were it was times 2.3 more vaccines were given during this time period, but we've got 6.2 times more types of adverse reactions. So what this is telling me is that the mRNA vaccines are having adverse effects on more systems of the body than conventional vaccines. And here we see that here. So here we see the influenza vaccine in purple and the COVID vaccines in red, and the more types of adverse reactions are occurring in the mRNA vaccines. And just to be clear, it's the mRNA vaccines that we want taken off the market. I don't think mRNA vaccines should be currently being given to human beings, or anyone for that matter, at the moment, until we know an awful lot more. So that's the types of reactions. This is the actual adverse events reporting system, influenza and COVID in VAERS. This is the number of reactions, the number of adverse events. And we see it's times 118. Now, as we mentioned, there was 2.3 times more vaccines being given. So that number, being generous, should be 2.3, not 118. So way more adverse reactions. Totally unacceptable numbers of adverse reactions, in my view. Why the regulators tolerate this is really quite beyond me, and I know beyond a lot of you. But that's the actual number of adverse events reported. Now this, put together by Dr. Jessica Rose, has done an awful lot of brilliant, Jessica Rose has done some brilliant statistical work and scientific work on this topic, and continues to be a real spokesperson, a spokeswoman for the ordinary man and woman who don't have the skills that she has. And that most certainly includes me. But here we see the age groups. So number of adverse events here. For example, we see in 0 to 4s there, 3,263. The idea that you would be giving experimental RNA vaccines to children 6 months to 4 years of age, I just find it reckless, appalling. But there we are. And then 5 to 11s, a bit lower in these age groups, but still an awful lot. And then the number of adverse reactions start to increase. And these are normalised per million doses in the different age groups. So a nice piece of work from Jessica there. Now, here we start to look at the pathology, and really we've known this for some time, that the vaccine is injected, the lipid nanoparticles go all around the body, they circulate to the heart, the lipid nanoparticles inject their mRNA into the myocardial cells, the myocytes. The myocytes express this foreign protein, the immune system recognises this foreign protein and attacks the whole cell. It's so simple. We've had this confirmed by numerous leading doctors and scientists we've talked to. And here they say that they're perfusion stable spike protein. So the myocardial cells, under the instructions, some might say under the dictate of the mRNA, produces the spike protein, and it doesn't wash away. It sticks to the surface of the myocyte, the myocardial cell membrane. And that's why the immune system can attack the whole thing, because it's stuck on the cell membrane. And of course, that's what causes the damage to the heart, the inflammation. And we also see in this pathology slide copy, we see fibrotic tissue, which would indicate some degree of healing. And we also see inflammatory immune cells attracted to the site of the inflammation. So confirmation from numerous types of literature of what we've already had confirmed on this channel. The lipid nanoparticles are systemically distributed and cause the spike protein to be produced all over the body. And yet these are still tolerated by regulators. Now, this one here, young males the highest risk. So age and sex, young males 12 to 24 face the highest risk, up to 7 times higher myocarditis incidence post-Moderna vaccine compared to their female counterparts. So young men at extremely high risk. Could be more information to come out from the American military yet, although that is somewhat covered in the paper. Hormonal influence, possibly. Testosterone may amplify the immune response, increasing myocardial inflammation. Obviously, young men have the highest amounts of testosterone, as you could judge from their behaviour sometimes. But let's not make light of this because it's a serious issue. Dose and timing. Risk spikes after the second dose, with higher rates linked to shorter dosing intervals. Don't want these things close together. Probably doesn't actually say this, but probably worse if there's been the natural infection as well, which of course was everywhere at the time. Moderna versus Pfizer. So Moderna has up to 3 to 5 times higher myocardial risk compared to the Pfizer vaccine, likely due to its higher RNA concentration. Now, I'd say the adverse reactions from the Pfizer are unacceptably high, but Moderna 3 to 5 times higher. Why on earth he wanted to put so much mRNA in the Moderna vaccine, I simply don't know. But of course, regardless of the amount of mRNA that you give, still the amount of spike protein that the body produces and where the body produces that spike protein is completely unpredictable. It's roll the dice and take your chances, isn't it? Also, genetic and immune factors. Certain genetic markers and immune dysregulation may contribute to increased susceptibility, as really you would have expected. That's usually the case. Now, this is quite concerning. Of those that got myopericarditis, 84 to 96% of Moderna RNA myocarditis cases required hospitalization. 50% showed long-term myocardial abnormalities. Now, this is particularly concerning, the reports of scarring in the myocardium. Basically, as I understand the pathology, once the myocardial muscle is dead and it's scarred, the muscle is never going to recover. We're talking about permanent myocardial damage in a proportion of these adverse events. And 10 to 20% fatality rate, quite appalling figures. Now, what this paper really usefully does is it, I don't like the term debunks, but it basically debunks quite a few myths that have been put about by certain people who knows, may have a vested interest. Let's look at those now. Misconception 1, infection causes more myocarditis. The fact, Moderna mRNA shots pose higher risk. So they're saying here that the Moderna shots have got a higher risk of myopericarditis compared to having the infection, especially in the younger, less at risk age groups whom this vaccine was forced upon, essentially, in many cases. Oh, that I had more of this data and the information was freely available and dispersed in 2021. At that time, we were still, let me rephrase that, I was still taking the word of authority. I feel deceived. It won't happen again. Misconception 2, Moderna mRNA related myocarditis is mild. It's not mild. It can be mild, but fact, long-term damage and death clearly documented. How much problems are still to become manifest? And of course, we could be talking about other complications, potential cancers. This is just, we'll stick to what this paper actually says. Risk-benefit ratio favours Moderna RNA shots. Fact, strong evidence contradicts this claim, which I would agree with. Now, just a couple more graphics. This is deaths related to baseline major cardiovascular diseases, and we see the numbers go up. Some extent in 2020, but also to a higher degree in 2021. above the baseline. I'm pretty sure that was from the insurer's data. Pretty sure that's from the insurer's data. Do download this for yourself, free PDF, quite readable actually, very thorough. And this is Ver's reports of myocarditis by age and dose. So here we see the doses, and you can unpick that a bit if you look at it in the PDF. But again, we see highest incidence in late teenagers, young adults, very young, basically young adults, going down with increasing age. So myths debunked. Phenomenon of myocarditis post SARS coronavirus 2 injection versus COVID-19 vaccine-induced myocarditis. This is pointing out, because what we were always told was the natural infection is more dangerous. This is what this is countermanding. So 1, severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2 and Omicron infections have caused more cases of myocarditis than COVID-19 mRNA vaccinations. Refuted. mRNA vaccine-induced myocarditis is typically mild, transient and rare, with no long-term sequelae. Refuted. The risk-benefit calculus favours continued use of products despite evidence of more iatrogenic, that's vaccine-caused cases. Refuted.
Well, a new government report accuses the U.S. government, meaning the CDC, the FDA, and Health and Human Services, of delaying or suppressing warnings about myocarditis or other adverse events following the mRNA COVID vaccine, especially in young people. Now, we're going to show you how, if they had warned people, they could have saved lives and prevented cardiac events. This is now irrefutable, and you should be mad as snakes about it. So let's dive in and see what there is to see. This comes from Senator Ron Johnson's Subcommittee on Investigations. It's called Failure to Warn: How Federal Agencies Downplayed the Risk of Myocarditis and Other Adverse Events Following COVID-19 Vaccinations, and it is damning. We should point out we only know about this because President Trump took office, because Senator Johnson had subpoenaed these emails repeatedly during the Biden administration and was put off. When President Trump took office in January of 2025, he was handing this very smoking gun, and he took it from there. He knew all of this was there. It was just a matter of seeing the emails. Now, here's why this is terrible. The U.S. government and the Israeli government both knew that the vaccination was associated with myocarditis in young people, particularly boys. And instead of warning the public or instigating a protocol to screen for it, they fooled around on emails and then did nothing that they could have stopped it. Now, who do you think, Clayton, if you say, who's the most active population of humans? When in life, who is the most active? Like in sports and things like that?
Probably like 14, 15, 16-year-old boys.
Yeah. Adolescent and young men, right?
Yeah.
This is the population that was having myocarditis, and they could have screened them and told them don't exercise for a while. But they let this active population out there in the world at risk. They did not notify the American public. In fact, they only notified Pfizer and Moderna. They gave them a heads up. And even worse, like they could have said, you could get hurt here. Let's screen for this. But instead, they just kind of faffed about on email. Now, you can help people with myocarditis. This is actively something you could do about it. We learned this from this 2023 study out of a university in Switzerland. It showed that people who were given the vaccine were then screened for myocarditis following the vaccination. You do this by searching for what's called a troponin in the blood. When they did find it, they warned those people. And they said, hey, you need to rest for the next couple of days because you have heart inflammation. If you don't, you can have a cardiac event. So let's say for the next week, you don't do exercise. When they did that, everyone was fine. Nobody had a cardiac event. Nobody collapsed. Listen to Dr. John Campbell explain this. This was from when the study was published in 2023.
So what they did, if people had raised troponins at 3 days after the booster, they said, look, you've got raised troponins after 3 days, therefore let's get a repeat blood test. Therefore, let's get a 12-lead ECG or other cardiological investigations as the cardiologists deem fit. Take rest, do not exercise, because if you've got myocarditis and you just rest for a few days, good chance it'll just go away, get better. If you go running or training, there's a good chance, not a good chance, but there's a chance you can go into a ventricular fibrillation, into a full cardiac arrest. So the fact that these people were warned is so important. Probably not happening where you are, certainly not happening where I am.
Okay, so in 2023, these scientists discovered this in Switzerland. Unfortunately, our own government knew that in 2021 and decided not to warn these people. So these people had a risk of myocarditis, they didn't screen for it, and they did not warn them. And then we saw evidence after evidence of young men collapsing on sports field. Now, the CDC, in fact, had drafted language in public warning the public about this. And here is the CDC official, Dr. Dimitri Descalaskis, saying, let's remove this. I don't think we need it. And in fact, he was the director at the time of the Division of HIV and AIDS Prevention. Why is he ringing in? Who the hell knows? And he's saying, no, I think that we should walk back this sentence, which we now know could have prevented attacks. The sentence was, and I'm sorry, it's a kind of a crap screenshot, but it's from the report, saying, due to concerns for sudden cardiac events while the heart recovers, consider restricting patients with myocarditis from rigorous activity like competitive sports for at least 3 months until cleared by a healthcare professional. How many of these people could have had this warning and they decided it was unnecessary? And then we saw when this protocol was instigated in Switzerland, it saved it saved people's lives. In fact, here's another draft of the Health Alert Network that, again, the CDC thought they should send out, warning to get troponin tests. They never published it. Instead, they talked themselves out of it with emails like this, like, oh, we're here deciding about the pros and cons of whether we should issue this. And the cons are that we don't want to appear alarmist.
I mean, okay, so wait a minute. That to me could be the most damning part of all of this, which is, okay, you've already notified Pfizer and Moderna of the risks of this.
Yes.
We know this, right?
Yes.
So you've notified them about it. So then these people are presumably taking the shot. I mean, that's bad enough that you knew about it and you're still allowing them to take it. But then you also know that there's post-vaccine treatment, which can help if there is myocarditis. And you're also choosing then not to tell parents about this treatment option that can help them if they do get myocarditis?
They chose not to. They could have said, let's screen for troponins if you're in this at-risk population, which is mostly young people, young men. If we see the troponins, you don't exercise for a while. Instead, they did not warn them. They vaccinated young people. They mandated it in most colleges and then let college athletes collapse on the field. We saw that happening. We know it happened. They chose not to warn about it. They only warned Pfizer and Moderna and said, hey, are we picking this up in our VAERS system, which is the adverse events system? Should we follow this? Why don't you let us know when you see this? Because again, doctors are not required to report adverse events. Neither are hospitals. Only the vaccine makers themselves are required. And how do they even know? Because they don't administer the vaccines. What were you going to say, David?
Well, I was going to say, and we all know that they tried to hide their own documentation of any adverse reactions for 75 years. But fortunately, that judge opened it up in Texas. But they didn't want us to know any of the adverse reactions.
Right. But this is showing us they knew that they could actually do something about it and prevent. So if you know somebody.
That's criminal negligence.
Yes, I would say it is. I think that.
Right, because they keep calling it a misstep. Oh, it was a misstep. No, it's not. It's not a misstep. It's criminal negligence.
I mean,
right. Go ahead, Philip.
I mean, it sounds like they're in a building. They see a fire. They don't want to pull the fire alarm because they don't want to appear alarmist. So what they do is they just notify the building owner, "Hey, there's a fire in your building. If you want to do something about it." And then
you probably don't want to alarm the people in the building. Yeah, you probably don't even want to tell the people in the building.
Yeah. You don't tell people in the building.
If you pull the fire alarm, you're an alarmist.
And then all those people end up dying in the building, and that's just a misstep.
Right.
It's a misstep. We should have, I don't know,
I'm sure. How would you feel if you or someone you loved had an incidence of myocarditis, did collapse during athletic activity, and know that the U.S. government knew that this was a risk and decided not to warn you about it? When all they had to do was tell you, this might be a risk, so rest. Screen your troponins and rest. How about that? You could have taken a few weeks off and not had a heart attack. How would you feel knowing that the government decided not to warn?
Well, not only that, but they gaslit people into thinking that they were stupid for thinking this was going on. That this was a conspiracy theory. This wasn't really happening. Yeah.
That's the third level, right? That's the third level because to me, and also they even took it to a fourth level. So, right, number one, they collaborated with Pfizer and Moderna. They told them they had this issue.
Yes, which they already knew in their clinical trials.
So they knew.
Was not news to
they
them.
knew and they knew. The government knew and they knew. The Big Pharma. Then they had the post-shot treatment options that they kept from the American people, didn't tell them that they could, watch your troponins and rest, right? So they kept that from them. Mm-hmm. The third level is exactly what Philip was talking about. They also then collaborated with the mainstream media to basically gaslight and call anyone like us a conspiracy theorist or block shows, ban shows, cancel doctors like Peter McCullough, Peter Corey, Robert Malone, and others who were noticing this myocarditis at the very beginning.
Right. And imagine had they issued this warning, then the media would have picked it up in this but it's still okay, kind of, well, we have to report on this, but it's still fine. The rest of us would have continued to research that, right? We didn't have that heads up in 2021. We only had it from the clinical trials and people who reported that who were called crazy. Right. And so, again, I don't need to tell you, you saw on social media, athlete after athlete collapsing, healthy people post-vaccination. So now we know this was real. They chose not to warn against it. So these doctors, especially the one that I showed you, who said, let's not send this, let's strike this from the warning, who then decided not to send the warning at all, they should lose their license, their medical license, permanent revocation, not just temporary, not just a punishment. They should be delicensed. And they should face charges for criminal behavior, malpractice, and ethical violations. Absolutely, that should happen. I don't think I've ever been this sure about anything until I've seen this. And so let me know what you think.
And also
Senator Ron Johnson, he can only do so much. He can only tell us, right? So now it's the Justice Department that needs to do that. Now this is the states. The state attorneys general needs to do something about this. It's not on us.
Oh, and Congress. Sorry to interrupt, David, but we need Congress to pass a law that enables us to actually sue these drug manufacturers over these vaccines. It's the only thing in America you can't sue for. Is the vaccines.
Right. We can't do anything other than just be outraged at this point until we have our lawmakers do something for us.
They're indemnified.
That's exactly what I was going to add, Clayton, to your list, that they were immune from any punitive, that you couldn't sue them over it. I was going to add that to your number 4 or 5 on your list.
Right, but
I think that's the only thing in America you can't sue for. Isn't that amazing? America's the sue happiest country in the world. And actually, I went through a roller coaster of emotions about that over the years. Oh, it's sue happy. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do that. And then I've actually come around on that because that's one way you can actually compel these companies to actually do right by people.
No, I believe we litigate our values. I think that we need the court system for this. But in this case, sure, Pfizer and Moderna have immunity. Do the CDC? Does the FDA? They purposely did not warn young boys who were getting the vaccination of these risks or screen them after when they drafted it. So how about who's going to sue the CDC, right? I don't know. Is there a case there? I have no idea.
The doctors must too, because I didn't see a bunch of lawsuits at doctors either that were giving people wrong information. Did you see a bunch of lawsuits for doctors? I didn't.
I don't know about. That's true. I haven't really heard about malpractice lawsuits for negligence. If you knew that this was the case, I don't know. I mean, you had people who get in deep trouble, like Dr. Peter McCullough, Peter Corey, Robert Malone, who were seeing myocarditis. They were telling people to avoid this. They were telling them, here's the protocols with Ivermectin and other things. And they were canceled. They lost their jobs.
I'm telling you right now, if I had a high school athlete who collapsed because of myocarditis, and the government purposely did not warn my son, I would be. Someone in the chat says class action. I would be looking into this. Absolutely, I would. This week, 60 Minutes did a terrifying report about how bird flu is poised to be the next pandemic. Now, we can't show you 60 Minutes videos from here because they take our videos down when we do. Here is the transcript. Look how scary this is. This is Dr. Angela Rasmussen, an American virologist working in Canada. She said that it's not just the number of human cases of bird flu that's alarming, but that the virus is jumping to more mammals. And it's basically E-I-E-I-O. It's chickens and pigs and raccoons, and she just goes down the list. She says she can't sleep at night and that we need to be actively testing for it and looking for it, or it's going to explode before our very eyes. Bill Whitaker says that if this does, in fact, become the next pandemic, he says it would make COVID look like a walk in the park. Dr. Pierre Corey is the founder of the Leading Edge Clinic and author of The War on Ivermectin, the medicine that saved millions and could have ended the pandemic. He joins us to discuss. So, doctor, how worried are you? Are you able to sleep at night, or are you up counting sheep like this virologist from Canada?
You're asking me, I am not worried at all. I mean, as you guys almost kind of pointed out, I mean, what makes an expert is pattern recognition, right? We've seen this playbook before, right? Instill fear at the same time that you come out with a fast-track approved vaccine, a terrifying vaccine, a self-amplifying mRNA vaccine, for avian flu, and you're trying to create and drive a market to get vaccinated. And, Clayton, I listened to you just a moment ago, and like you, I don't think this playbook works anymore. I mean, their big show was COVID. They've been trying to do it again. I remember our smallpox pandemic that they tried to scare us with, right? The whole thing was silly. This one, although I'm a little dismissive, avian flu, if it does jump to humans, which there's no, conclusive evidence that's doing that to any significant degree, it's all potential. That does have a higher mortality rate. That is difficult. But here's the thing. The real reason why I'm not worried, two of them. One, we have learned so much about how to treat viruses. I have a dozen therapeutics in my toolbox, which I know would cure avian flu. That's number one. Number two, and this is where it gets absurd, we shouldn't even be talking about avian flu. It could be eradicated today just by treating the water that the chickens drink. There's something called chlorine dioxide, which is at high levels, it can be used as a disinfectant. It's also used as a water purifier, but it's the ultimate biocide. It kills viruses, fungi, bacteria, all pathogens. All you have to do is raise the concentration in their drinking water, and we wouldn't be talking about this. But I'm hard to come up with simple solutions to apparently intractable problems.
It seemed crazy. I mean, watching that 60 Minutes clip, I mean, they really are pushing this agenda. So do you think it seems like it's right out of this playbook where they're trying to get us all scared, and then they're really trying to activate the vaccine manufacturers? Like you mentioned it a second ago. Do you think that that's the playbook here, is really to sort of, all right, we got to fast track billions of dollars in these new vaccines?
I do. I mean, I think I'm seeing that pattern also around this measles, right? I don't know if you guys are aware, but I was involved with children's health events and reviewing the cases of these two supposed measles deaths. They are amplifying that and fear-mongering that. Those children did not die of measles by any stretch of the imagination, but yet they're trying to fear-monger everyone into rushing to get an mRNA vaccine. And, maybe I am oversimplifying and drawing rapid conclusions, but where are the cases? Why are they doing a 60 Minutes on it right now? There's no evidence that it's harming us or that it's a true threat to us. But I think it's the beginning steps of that playbook, right, is to start to foment the fear, bring awareness to it, and then hopefully people be receptive to whatever their newest single solution is that's highly profitable to the vaccine industry. You don't hear about simple, low-cost, available, safe solutions that don't bring profits, and I know of many of them.
Well, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, declared a state of emergency over bird flu last year, right before Christmas. Why has he not looked into treating the water if it's such a state of emergency? What the hell is he doing in that frantic state?
Well, you're leading me to an uncomfortable answer, which is maybe they don't want a solution. Maybe the solution that they want is the solution they're providing, right? And there's a lot of incentives to that being the solution. And, And that's what is just endlessly, to say I'm disappointed or disturbed. I don't think there are words to really describe the way I see these authorities and institutions of government and society, the way they behave. I mean, they're really, they seem influenced to achieve a certain outcome and a certain solution at the disregard of all other safer, simpler ones.
Right. And one thing, I'm sorry, let me just, last year we talked to Dr. Kelly Victory, and she said, look, we knew how to treat COVID. We weren't allowed to say so. And
you were not allowed to say so,
right.
Dr. Corey.
So that's what she's worried about with bird flu, is what you just said. We do know how to treat bird flu. What if we're not allowed to say so if and when this happens as a media pandemic?
Again, you're calling out the playbook, right? So in order to do what we were just talking about, you have to suppress effective early treatments. They did that incredibly successfully in COVID, starting with, and I've talked about this in the journal, I mean, I nailed their playbook. I mean, the number one step is to publish articles in high impact journals showing that these safe, effective treatments actually don't work. They manipulate studies to do that. Then that gives them the foundation to enact all sorts of policies and punishments for those who decide to willfully ignore those august, high quality, rigorous trials. And it's a tired playbook, but that's going to be part of it. You guys know this. That's going to be part of it. If avian flu becomes a real thing, and I did what I did with my colleagues and my organization back in COVID with the FLCC, we try to put out treatment protocols, and people start to use some of the modalities that we recommend, you're going to find the medical boards coming after them. The same stuff, persecutions. I mean, it is really a very it's a rapacious industry. And the way in which they drive business and fight competition, it's not like any other industry at all. They literally go after people's livelihoods, their reputations, their credibilities. It's not like the iPhone beating the BlackBerry. Right. True competition. Here you come up with a different solution that threatens their market. They do not play in pharma. I mean, that is a criminal syndicate. We have many decades of evidence that they literally behave like a criminal syndicate. They do not care about our health. They put profits before people all the time. And they pull these shenanigans to amazing financial success. We have to get
I saw the fugitive. I know.
Chairman Mao would have been very happy about this. I mean, this is not capitalism at work. You're picking winners and losers, and you have partners inside the government who are picking winners and losers, and they're silencing through censorship people like yourself, Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Robert Malone, a whole host of doctors we've had on the show who've been silenced. But so we're out in front of it now, right? You mentioned off the top that there's at least a dozen different modalities, things that you could be able to use to stop avian flu if it did make that jump in humans or whatever to cure it and to fix it. So put it on the record right now. You don't have to go through all 12 of them. But if there are people who are scared right now watching this, hopefully none of them ever watch CBS or 60 Minutes who watch our show. But we've got tens of thousands of people watching us right now live. So if they wanted to stock up on something in their home, just to have it in their medicine cabinet, what would be something that you would recommend?
So first and foremost, I would say the one that has the evidence base already that you would is sort of nasopharyngeal sterilization or disinfection. So things like iodine sprays, xylitol sprays. We know they're antiviral. The nasal carriage and pharyngeal apparatus has the highest burden of those viruses. And we know if you reduce viral loads simply by topical applications, mouthwashes, sprays, you actually reduce mortality rates as well as time to recovery. That's just one, right? Then there are others which are a little bit more theoretical. So for instance, ivermectin, very good broad antiviral. Things like nitazoxanide, which isn't very available here, but it's available in South America and Africa. Those have broad antiviral properties. And then I'm going to come back to a really dangerous topic, which is chlorine dioxide, which is very widely available. It's excellent at killing all infectious pathogens, and it's actually safe to take at therapeutic levels in water. We know what the safe levels for routine drinking water disinfection are, but those levels are far below any toxicity levels, and therapeutic ranges are just above that. I'm just going to come out on record saying that if I got avian flu tomorrow, that's what I would use. in terms of what I think would be the most potent. But there's also things like, if we knew it was coming, we should have a national campaign to replenish vitamin D levels. We know the higher your vitamin D, that your chances of dying from any infection are markedly reduced. And so I think there's a bunch of sunlight. Sunlight's what saved most people in the 1918 flu. And so there's lots of just different approaches, not only to maintain and make robust your immune system, but also that have antiviral properties. Things like artemisinin, right, which is a native. It comes from a plant that was highly effective in COVID. I've heard from colleagues from different countries, they had no problems with COVID using that. So there's lots of options that are safe, that have been well studied and used, and so they're not like risky proposals. And I think they would just put forth so much potential benefit that this fear mongering wouldn't stick.
Yeah,
now,
and I think, sorry.
What do you think?
No, I was going to say, but none of what you just said there is going to make Big Pharma a lot of money. So they're going to probably silence you and try to hide it,
Right.
Sunlight.
We should make clear we're not diagnosing you. If you think you have bird flu or anything like it, you should talk about these treatments with your doctor.
Dr. Corey, I'm not a doctor. I
Right.
just play one on television.
So we need to make that clear. Now, one thing that I've started to see the media come to a crescendo is about tuberculosis. We've seen that in the UK, they have a 13% rise in cases over the last year in tuberculosis, which is serious. We see in the United States now 8% increase in cases. Just this week, my son said that someone he knew at school had tuberculosis. And in the year 2025, we do not vaccinate for it in most developed countries. If this had been the pandemic, maybe we would have reacted very differently. Is this a new media scare, do you think? Or how do we assess what the media is telling us now about rise in tuberculosis?
Okay, now you guys are officially triggering me, and I'm saying that somewhat humorously. And the reason why is,
okay.
All right, let me speak to your question. I do not think that is about fear mongering or trying to drive, arms to get vaccines for TB. There is no vaccine for TB. So that for that reason, no. But when I say you're triggering me is that article about this unexplained rise in TB cases. What I get triggered of is that's not the only disease that is surging across the world. There's 13 different infectious diseases that are surging in countries all across the world. Mystery pneumonias, viruses, even older ones. There's strep that's going around. There's brain-eating fungi rises in cases. Innumerable infectious diseases, of which TB is one of them. And what triggers me is every time you read an article by this, and there's one article in Bloomberg for about 8 months ago, which did an amazing review of all the epidemiology of these rising infections. Every article, you know what they come up with the reason for this? Again, this is the not calling out the elephant in the room, which is the massive immune dysregulation, immune suppression after a global mRNA vaccine campaign. That is what we're seeing. That article is literally calling out to these disturbing rises in infectious illnesses that are hitting people in sectors. Like if you read that article on TB, they are finding TB in people without traditional risk factors. Nowhere is it mentioned that there's a vaccine. The one reason they gave in that article for why those TB cases is because of interruptions to medical care from the pandemic. So there's delays in diagnosis. Absolute nonsense. On its face, that makes no sense with TB. You don't diagnose TB until you get symptoms. So don't tell me that this is delays in care. And so it's part and parcel of the tragic humanitarian consequences of the folly of an mRNA global vaccine campaign. And we're paying for it now. People are getting sick with illnesses they traditionally weren't getting sick from, not only infections, but cancers. And that's just the plain reality. I've deeply studied on this, and I'm sorry to be myself fear-mongering, but we're in trouble. What they did in COVID, we're still paying for, and people are getting sick as a result.
Yeah, and you were warning about it. I mean, I wish you weren't canceled over it. I wish people would have paid attention to it. Well, you've written a book, The War on Ivermectin. But I want to get you out of here on two last questions, Doc, which is, well, how do we treat this? If you have this spike protein, if you've got this in your body, all these people are getting sick, these 13 highly contagious diseases across the world. What is your recommendation for people now to get this out of their body? Can they?
Yeah, so I specialize in that. That's what my clinic does. let me just speak to TB because, I started a new nonprofit with colleagues called Rebuild Medicine, and we are doing some that RFK Jr. has mentioned as part of his policy agenda, which is that we are furthering research into repurposed drugs. We are about to fund and start a study. I won't tell you what country it is, but we're studying the efficacy of chlorine dioxide in TB. So we're all looking for new solutions for infectious illnesses. But to your question in terms of vaccine injury, Clayton, that would be an hour-long episode because there's no single thing. And even that question of can we get rid of spike protein, we don't really have commercially available tests for measuring spike loads. We do tend to follow spike antibody levels, which we think is a proxy. I do have a number of things that can reduce those levels. I just have not yet been convinced that that's the target. I use many different therapies. Not one thing works in everyone. I can see 2 patients with vaccine injury who appear very similarly, and 2 therapies will work great in the first one and do nothing in the second. So it really I'll finish my answer by saying that is a very complex and idiosyncratic disease for which you need to work with patients, and you have to do repeated therapeutic trials using, pharmacologic or supplements or nutraceuticals that have mechanisms of action that can marry the disturbances in their pathophysiology. And so it's not a short answer, and I'm still working at it. I've been at it 3 years. I am 100 times better at treating it than I was 3 years ago, but I need to be 100 times more because it's still a tough disease to treat.
Well, we'll have you. We'll do a whole hour-long interview with you on vaccine
Sure.
injury. We'll do that. So we'll put that on the book. So we'll talk to our team and make that happen. So I will get you out of here on this. You wrote the book War on Ivermectin. President Trump it seems like major moves towards making ivermectin available to Americans in a larger way. I mean, if you would have said this like a few years ago, you would probably have fallen off of your chair because you were silenced. You were canceled for telling people about ivermectin. I mean, what was your response to hearing the Trump administration wants to make it available more readily for Americans?
I feel not only vindicated, but so satisfied because I think it's the work of myself and my colleagues. We were conflicts of interest free, deeply studied, scientific, putting out accurate information, and to find that it resonates and is gaining traction. And, you mentioned Trump, but I'm as equally as impressed with the states, right? There's, I think, almost a dozen states now that have legislation on the books to make it available over the counter. Its utility in treating cancer is becoming more and more widely recognized. And so, the Nobel Prize winning discoverer called it the wonder drug, and it truly is. It's unique in our total pharmaceutical armamentarium over decades. It's one of the most unique medicines in terms of its unparalleled safety and broad applicability. And so I can't think of anything better for, furthering the treatment of illnesses than having the role of ivermectin be recognized. So it's very gratifying, and so I'm happy to see that it's gaining traction and people are realizing that we weren't misinformationists. We were just trying to do the right thing and teach people things that we thought could help them.
Yeah. Tell that to Jimmy Kimmel, who was making fun of people for using horse goo or whatever his comment was that time. And it's kind of amazing because, even on YouTube, we broadcast on multiple places, but in their terms of service on YouTube, they specifically forbid the use of that language. Like you couldn't talk about that. You couldn't even use the I word. It's unbelievable. Like the censorship industrial complex that was put in place. So we've come a long way in a few years.
I did an interview with Matt Taibbi. I always remember this. Did an interview with him a few years ago, and he wrote an article. I was profiled in it, and he called me the ghost of the internet because whatever podcast I went on, they disappeared. They were taken down, shadow banned, demonetized. And wow. I think I know I did an interview with you. I don't know if you put it up on YouTube, but it's a pretty good way to get your head cut off.
Yeah, no. I think at the time, because it was still banned on YouTube, we could only release it on Rumble. Isn't that crazy? Yep. And now here we are. Like we're live on YouTube right now, thousands of people watching. So it's like we've come a long way, I think. Yeah. So it's good. I think we're making some strides in that regard. Dr. Pierre Kory, great to see you. Thank you so much. And we'll get it on the books. We'll have you on for a long time. We'll talk about vaccine injuries.
Love it. Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Perfect. Thanks, Doc. Great to see you.